What is the history of Ward Church? Ward Church started in 1956. Our original church property was in Livonia on the corner of 6 Mile and Farmington. We later moved just down the road to our Northville property in 1998. And while our church started in 1956, we have roots that go back much, much farther. We are the daughter church. We were planted by the Elizabeth W. Ward Memorial Presbyterian Church of Detroit. It's got a name that just rolls off the tongue. That Detroit church started in 1928. In the 1950s, the suburbs were booming. People were moving out and moving in a westerly direction, and the presbytery was looking for a church that would answer the call to the western frontier and serve the people that were moving to these rapidly growing suburbs. And the Elizabeth W. Ward Memorial Presbyterian Church of Detroit answered the call and put a satellite church, put a branch in the city of Livonia. The very first worship service in Livonia was May 6, 1956. And that's the day we mark as our anniversary, as our birthday. And our founding pastor, Dr. Bartlett Hess, would give the sermon to the Detroit congregation, and then he would get in the car, and his wife Margaret would drive him out to Livonia, where he gave the sermon a second time. We were one church in two locations before anybody knew what that was. 1956. And after 12 years of that, it was determined that the two congregations should become churches in their own right. The suburban church was actually larger than the Detroit church, and Dr. Bart Hess became the senior pastor at the Livonia branch, and David Owen became the pastor of the Detroit branch, and the two separated. At that time, we wondered what should be the name of our new church in Livonia, but for 12 years we had gone by the name Ward, and that was our reputation, and so we kept that name as Ward Church. Ward Church has always been involved in church planting. In 1979, we started our first daughter church. We gave birth to our first daughter. She was beautiful. Trinity Presbyterian Church in Plymouth. In 1983, we started Grace Chapel in Farmington Hills. In 1986, we started Cornerstone Church in Brighton. Ward Church also had a hand in starting Faith Church in Rochester Hills, Knox Church in Ann Arbor, and several others. And in recent years, we've been involved in starting churches as part of a church network. This network made up mostly of us and our daughter churches. And we've had the privilege of starting two churches in Detroit and one currently in progress in Hamtramck. So church planting, the starting of new works, has long been part of our history, and it's still of value today. When we first bought the property in Northville, we originally purchased 140 acres. It was all farmland, 140 acres. And because of the way the area was growing and real estate rates were rising, we paid about $4 million, under $4 million for 140 acres. Just a few years later, we sold off 40 acres for $9 million. Okay, let's review. We bought 140 for $3 million. Sold off 40 for $9 million, and that's why we have a big, beautiful, debt-free building today. People often see our building and the size of it, and they say, wow, you must have some rich people in your church. You must have some deep pockets. Not true. We have a lot of faithful people giving what they can, and we have a God who apparently was in the real estate business in the 90s. Just another way that God has creatively provided for our church. One example among many of God's provision for us over these many years. So that's a bit of our history, and our history has shaped us. This is why our church continues to have such strong ties to the city of Detroit. For us, the city of Detroit's not just our neighbor, it's our roots, it's our history. And that's why we have served and given and been a part of it for multiple decades, because it is part of who we are. That's why we're so involved in church planting still today, because it is our history, it's our roots, it's in our DNA. I'm so grateful for those early pioneers that came out for a new work, and may we find pioneers in every generation.